The piercing wind howled among the ruins of a devastated city. The snow fell in heavy sheets, covering the remains of buildings that had once been homes, schools, markets. Now, everything was gray. War not only destroyed cities, but also hearts. Among the Russian soldiers huddled in the trenches, a young man stared into the night. His clear eyes reflected the pale light of the moon, but within them burned a flame of longing and hope. Viktor Petrov, a Red Army soldier, held in his gunpowder-stained hands a small piece of paper, a letter. The war had been going on for years, consuming lives, separating loves, turning young people into soldiers and dreams into distant memories. For Viktor, each day he survived was a victory, but also a sentence. Every moment he spent there, away from Anna, was an invisible pain that consumed him. They met before the war, in a small village in the Russian countryside. Their love blossomed in times of uncertainty, like a rose stubbornly growing in the harsh winter. The promise of a future together was made without words, just in looks and touches. When Viktor was called to war, Anna held his hand tightly, her eyes filling with tears. "Come back to me." Viktor didn't say anything, just smiled. But deep down, he knew the chances were slim. The war was relentless. Still, deep in his heart, he clung to that promise. He fought not only for the country, but for a much stronger reason, to return to Anna's arms. In the trench, he felt the cold invade his bones. The improvised fire barely warmed the exhausted and hungry men. The smell of wet earth and gunpowder permeated everything. The early morning silence was broken only by distant explosions and the whispers of soldiers exchanging stories about home. Dmitri, his best friend, sat next to him, watching him hold the letter. "What do you write, Viktor?" he asked, blowing on his hands to warm them. Viktor smiled, a small, tired smile. "Something I should have told her before I left." Dmitri didn't ask anything else. He just nodded, understanding. In war, words were not easy to say. The constant fear of not seeing tomorrow made everything more urgent and at the same time impossible to express. Viktor held the pencil firmly and began to write. Every word, every line was a piece of his soul transcribed onto paper. "Anna, my sweet Anna, if you were reading this letter, it means something happened to me. But don't think about the sadness, but about the love I always felt for you. From the moment I saw you, I knew that my life would have meaning by your side. Every day away from you is a bigger battle than any I faced on the battlefield. But even in the darkness, your face illuminates my thoughts. If I come back, I want you to know that I want to spend the rest of my life by your side. If I don't come back, please be happy, love, alive, and never forget that wherever I am, I'll be waiting for you." The letter was not yet finished. The most important part was missing. But Viktor knew that request had to be done right, not just with words, but with the heart. The cold set in, and a scream echoed through the camp. A warning. The soldiers stood up, grabbing their rifles. The battle never expected, and the marriage proposal would be for later. The war was not just about explosions and trenches. There was something much stronger, something that the soldiers carried in their chests, and that made them resist the horrors of the battlefield, the memories of home, the people they loved, and the promises they left behind. For Viktor Petrov, this strength came from Anna. Whenever the cold of war tried to freeze his hope, Viktor clung to the memories of their time together. He closed his eyes and saw Anna as he had the first time, wearing a simple blue coat, her hair tied into a messy braid, and her eyes full of life. Fate brought them together on an ordinary day, but what started as a chance meeting turned into the reason he wanted to survive. It was a spring afternoon, when the shy flowers were beginning to bloom after the long Russian winter. Viktor was helping a village merchant unload sacks of wheat when he heard a light laugh, like the sound of water running through a stream. When he turned around, he saw a young woman trying to balance a basket full of apples that, one by one, were rolling across the dirt floor. Without thinking, he ran to her and helped her collect the fruits. When their eyes met, time seemed to stop for an instant. "Thanks," said Anna, adjusting the basket with a shy smile. "I think I lost a battle to these apples," Viktor joked, handing over the last fruit. She laughed, and in that moment he knew he would never forget that sound. From that day on, meetings between the two became frequent. Anna used to go to the market on Saturday mornings, and Viktor always found a reason to be there. They talked about simple things, the weather, their neighbors, their dreams, but behind the casual words, There was something growing between them. Anna wasn't just beautiful. He had a natural kindness that warmed those around him. He took care of the village's elders, helped the children, and always found a reason to smile, even when life wasn't easy. Victor felt that around her, everything made sense. It was on a summer night, under the starry sky. They were walking through the woods near the village, and Victor, without realizing it, held Anna's hand. She didn't back down. "What if everything changes?" Anna asked, looking up at the sky. "What do you mean?" "The war. They say they will soon call more young people to fight." Victor felt a tightness in his chest. It was true. The tension grew every day, and everyone knew that sooner or later he would be called up. Without thinking, he turned to her. "I wanted to say so many things. I wanted to promise that nothing would separate them. But how could I promise something that I couldn't guarantee?" So instead of words, he kissed her. It was a soft kiss, full of feelings that didn't need to be said. A kiss that carried a silent promise. "I will come back to you." Months later, the call came. Victor was supposed to report to the army the next morning. The night before, he met with Anna one last time. They were in the same woods where they had kissed for the first time. But this time, there was no laughter, just the weight of goodbye. Anna held his hand tightly, as if to stop him from leaving. "Come back to me, Victor." He ran his fingers over her face, trying to memorize every detail. "I'll be back." But deep down, I knew that war made no promises. That night, when he left, he took with him the warmth of Anna's touch and the knowledge that, no matter what, his heart would always belong to her. The winter of 1943 punished the soldiers with its merciless fury. Snow accumulated in the trenches, making every move a challenge. The cold penetrated the bones, and hunger gnawed at the men's strength. But none of this worried Viktor Petrov as much as the weight he carried in his heart. Amid the horror of war, the only thing that kept him standing was the memory of Anna. She was his refuge in the midst of chaos, his lighthouse in the midst of darkness. In rare moments of tranquility, Victor allowed himself to close his eyes and transport himself back to the village, to the days when he held Anna's hand and dreamed of a future by her side. But dreams, like life in war, were uncertain. He knew that each battle could be his last, and that was why he decided to write the most important letter of his life. It was already night, and the camp was immersed in an uneasy silence. The wind cut like razors, and the only source of heat was a makeshift fire. The soldiers huddled in their threadbare uniforms, sharing cigarettes and stories about home. Victor moved away a little, finding shelter behind a pile of sandbags. He sat on the frozen ground, breathing deeply. He picked up a piece of paper and a small pencil, both crumpled and dirty with gunpowder. There, in the middle of nowhere, under a starless sky, he decided it was time to put his feelings into words. His heart was beating fast. He was never a man of great speeches, but the letter needed to be perfect. After all, it was a marriage proposal, the request he should have made before leaving, but which the rush and uncertainty of war had stolen from him. With shaking hands, he began to write. "My dear Anna, I know this letter may never reach you, but I need to write it anyway. In the war, I learned many things. I learned that life is fragile, that time is a cruel enemy, and that a man can endure any pain except missing the one he loves. Anna, you are the only thing that keeps me standing. When I close my eyes, I see your smile. When everything around me is cold and despair, I remember the warmth of your embrace. I should have told you this sooner, but I believed I had time. Now I understand that time was never my ally. So, if there is still a chance, if God allows this letter to reach you, I need you to know, I want to marry you. I know I'm not a perfect man. I know that war can change me forever. But if you still want to wait for me, if you can still love me after all this, I promise that I will come back, and I will spend every day of my life trying to make you happy. If I don't come back, I don't want you to live trapped in my memory. I want you to be happy. I want you to love. I want you to live. But if you can, save a piece of your heart for me, because mine will always be yours. With all the love that is in me, Victor." He read and reread the words, feeling the weight of each one of them. The letter wasn't just a marriage proposal. It was a testament of love, a promise, a farewell. He carefully folded the paper and placed it inside the inside pocket of his uniform. "Tomorrow, I would give the letter to Dmitri, your best friend. If something happened, he would make sure Anna got his words. But for now, Victor allowed himself a brief moment of peace. At that moment, under the silently falling snow, he closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "Wait for me, Anna. What if you only had one chance to tell someone how you really feel, but you didn't know if that message would reach its destination?" Victor wrote his words from the heart, but fate is not always kind to lovers separated by war. In the next chapter, you will discover the true content of this letter, word for word, and understand the weight of every sentence Victor wrote for Anna. If this story is touching your heart, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This helps us keep bringing exciting stories like this to you. And now, get ready, because Victor's love will be revealed in its purest form. 4. The content of the letter war can take everything from a man, his peace, his home, even his life. But there is something that not even bombs and gunshots can erase: true love. And it was with this love that Viktor Petrov wrote the most important letter of his life. The snow continued to fall silently around the camp, and the small fire the soldiers had lit could barely combat the cold. But none of that mattered to Victor. On that piece of paper, he poured his entire soul. Each word written was an invisible thread that connected him to Anna. As if by writing he could shorten the distance between them. He was not a poet. I didn't know how to transform feelings into beautiful sentences, but he knew what he felt, and that was enough. Victor read his letter one last time, murmuring each word as if he was speaking directly to Anna. "My dear Anna, if there's anything this war has taught me, it's that time is cruel. We believe that we will always have one more day, one more chance to say what we feel. But here, where every dawn could be the last, I understood that I can no longer wait to tell you what's in my heart. I love you. I've always loved you, from the moment our eyes met that spring afternoon, when the apples rolled across the ground and you smiled at me. Since then, every day has been a battle against distance, against longing, against the fear that one day I wouldn't have the opportunity to tell you this. And now, in the middle of this war that seems to have no end, I want to make a request that I should have made before leaving. Anna, will you marry me? I know I'm not the most perfect man. War changes us, and maybe if I return, I won't be quite the same Victor who left. But if you can still love me, if you still want to wait for me, I promise I will come back and spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy. If fate is cruel and this letter is the only thing left of me, then I want you to know you were my biggest dream, my greatest love. And even if time separates us, I promise that I will be waiting for you, wherever life's path takes us. Be happy, my Anna. Love, live, and never forget that wherever I am, my heart will always belong to you. With all the love that is in me, Victor. When he finished reading, Victor felt a lump in his throat. The letter wasn't just a marriage proposal. It was a testament to everything he had held in his heart. Dmitri, his closest friend, watched silently. He knew what that meant. "Do you want me to take you to her in case something happens?" he asked in a low voice. Victor nodded. "Promise me, Dmitri. If I don't come back, you will give this letter to Anna." Dmitri took the envelope carefully, realizing the invisible weight it carried. "I promise." Destiny, however, does not always fulfill men's promises. The next morning, Victor received orders for his most dangerous mission, and he could never have imagined that that letter, his last words to Honor, would never reach her hands. Dawn came cold and silent, as if the world was holding its breath before the storm. The distant sound of gunfire and explosions echoed. Across the horizon, a cruel reminder that the war never slept. Viktor Petrov was used to this awakening. But that day, there was something different in the air. An invisible weight tightened his chest, like a dark omen he tried to ignore. He stood up slowly, stretching his muscles stiff from the cold. Around him, other soldiers did the same, preparing for another day of combat. Some exchanged cigarettes, others checked their weapons, and there were those who simply stared into space, as if trying to remember what it meant to live before the war. Dmitri approached, holding the letter that Victor had given him the night before. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, lifting the envelope with a worried look. Victor nodded. "If something happens to me, hand it over to Anna. Promise me that, Dmitri." His friend took a deep breath and put the letter in the inside pocket of his coat. "I promise." The commander's call interrupted any further conversation. It was mission time. The patrol was to advance through enemy territory in a risky operation to cut off the German supply lines. The orders were clear: infiltrate the ruins of the nearby town, destroy the Nazi ammunition depot, and retreat before they were detected. Victor clenched his fists. He knew that missions like this rarely ended without casualties, but there was no choice. The group moved silently through the snow-covered forest, the branches creaking under the weight of their bodies. The cold cut like blades, and each step was taken with caution, as the enemy could be anywhere. After hours of marching, they saw the first destroyed buildings. The city, which was once a home to hundreds of people, was now nothing more than rubble. The smell of burning and gunpowder permeated the air. Victor ducked behind a stone wall, watching the target ahead, an old brick building that served as a supply depot for the Germans. Nazi soldiers guarded the place, patrolling the surroundings with rifles ready to fire. The commander made a signal. It was time to act. Russian soldiers spread out, taking strategic positions. The first explosion came like thunder through the snow. The warehouse began to collapse, while gunshots multiplied in all directions. Victor ran, his gun gripped firmly in his hands. He fired at enemies, moving through the rubble, trying to stay alive in the chaos. That's when he heard the scream. Dmitri. Victor turned round in time to see him fall, hit in the shoulder by an enemy bullet. Without hesitation, he ran towards him, trying to help him get up. But the Germans were everywhere, and the weather was cruel. "Wow, Victor," Dmitri screamed, coughing up blood. "I won't leave you here." The shooting continued, and the Russians were being forced to retreat. Victor looked around, looking for a way out, but he saw something that made his heart stop. The enemy soldiers were picking up the letter lying in the snow. The letter to Anna. The Germans took it without understanding its value, just another piece of paper lost on the battlefield. But for Victor, it was everything. He ran towards them, taking off, ignoring Dmitri's screams. He needed that letter back. He needed to make sure Anna knew how he felt. It was then that he felt the impact. A sharp pain ripped through his left side, and everything seemed to slow down. His body lost strength, and he fell to his knees in the blood-stained snow. The last thing he saw was a Nazi soldier burning the letter, before fleeing, his last request, his last words to Anna, consumed by flames. Hours later, when the fighting finally ceased, the few Russian survivors were taken from the battlefield. Victor was among them, unconscious, his life hanging by a thread. Dmitri, even though he was injured, crawled to him, holding his bloody face. "Hang in there, Victor. You still need to get back to her." But fate had already decided. Victor's letter would never reach its destination, and Anna would never know what he had written. The days passed slowly in the small village where Anna lived. The winter of 1943 seemed endless, covering the streets and houses with a thick layer of snow. But the real cold was inside her, a cold that came from uncertainty, from absence, from the longing that consumed her every thought. Since the day Victor left for war, Anna had been counting the days. First, I expected letters. Then I waited for news. Now I waited for any sign that he was still alive. Each morning, before the sun rose, she would leave the house and walk to the train station. There, wounded soldiers returned in groups, many supported by comrades, others carried on stretchers, and some in coffins covered with flags. She stood there, watching each face, anxiously searching Victor's eyes among the crowd, but he was never there. In the first few months after his departure, Victor had sent a few letters. They were always short, but full of emotion. "I'm fine, Anna. The cold here is cruel, but your love keeps me warm. I think about you every night. When I close my eyes, I smell you. I hear your laugh. I can still hold your hand in my dreams. I promised I would come back, and I will keep that promise. Wait for me." Anna read and reread each one of them, memorizing every word. They were all he had of Victor. But then, the letters stopped arriving. Weeks turned into months, and the absence of news became a crushing weight on his chest. She tried to convince herself that the delays were normal, that perhaps Victor was on a long mission and would soon write again. But deep down, a growing fear tormented her. What if he never came back? In the village, everyone knew the story of Anna and Victor. Their love was one of those tales that warmed people's hearts, even in dark times. Mr. Ivanov, an old watchmaker who lived in the main square, always said to Anna, "Time may seem cruel, my girl, but it always reveals the truth." She clung to those words, because the truth she wanted was just one. Victor was still alive and would return to her. She refused to accept any other possibility. At night, Anna dreamed of him. In the dreams, Victor was at home. He smiled at her, held her face in his hands, said words she couldn't hear. but every time, before he could touch it, it disappeared like mist in the wind. She would wake up scared, her chest tight, her heart racing. The uncertainty was worse than any pain. It was a day like any other when a group of soldiers arrived at the village. They were bringing wounded people and delivering news to families. Anna ran towards them, as she did every time. "Sir, please, Viktor Petrov, is there any news of him?" she asked one of the officers desperately. The man frowned and consulted a list in his hands. "Petrov," he murmured, scrolling through the names. Anna held her breath, but then he shook his head. No information. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. No information, no certainty, no body. Viktor simply disappeared. He was not on the death list. He was not on the injured list. It was as if he had been swallowed by the war. And that meant only one thing. Anna's wait was far from over. Time passed. The seasons followed one another mercilessly, and the war, which seemed endless, finally began to show signs of tiredness. In 1945, the fighting eased. Soldiers began to return, and the world slowly tried to rebuild itself. But for Anna, the war was not over yet. Every day without news from Viktor was a battle she fought alone. Church bells rang in the village, announcing the end of the conflict. People took to the streets. Some celebrated, others cried for those who would never return. Mothers and wives rushed to the station, hoping to reunite with the men who left years before. Anna went to Tsitsi. She was there every time a new group of soldiers arrived. But each time the unfamiliar faces passed by her, her hope diminished a little more. The scene was always the same: families hugging, tears of relief, screams of happiness. But for every hug, there were also those who stood, waiting for someone who never got off the train. Anna was one of those people. Time seemed to drag on in a cruel cycle. Whenever a new wave of soldiers returned, she was filled with hope. But then, the last man left, the train doors closed, and the silence screamed louder than any celebration. The days turned into months. People began to return to their routine, rebuilding their homes, trying to find meaning after so many years of destruction. But how do you rebuild a heart that has been torn apart by waiting? Anna didn't know how to answer. The village where she lived was no longer the same. Familiar faces were marked with grief. Many homes were empty, and the streets seemed quieter. Mr. Ivanov, the watchmaker, was still in his shop, but his gaze no longer carried the same shine. Time reveals all truths, my girl. Anna came to hate that phrase, because the truth that time showed was that, worst of all, Viktor would not return. But without a body, without a final letter, without a testimony of his death, how could she accept it? It was this doubt that kept her trapped between hope and grief. In the corner of Anna's room, there was a small wooden box where she kept everything she had of Viktor. The few letters he'd sent, a handkerchief he'd given her before he left, and an old photograph of the two of them taken the summer before the war. Every night, before going to sleep, she opened the box and reread the letters. He touched the photo with trembling fingers, as if he could feel Viktor there. "You promised to come back to me," he whispered. But the only answer was silence. Time, always him, continued to advance mercilessly. People around Anna began to suggest that she move on. "You need to accept that he is gone, my dear. The war has taken many men. Maybe it's time to stop waiting." But how could she stop hoping when there was still a small spark of hope burning inside her? Anna fought this idea for a long time. But one day, when she returned from the train station for the 1000th time, she found her mother waiting for her at the door. Her gaze was filled with sadness, but also with truth. "Daughter, he's not coming back." And at that moment, something inside Anna broke. She entered her room, took the box of memories and, for the first time, thought about keeping it forever. He thought about forgetting him. But was it possible to forget someone who was your whole life? Anna never saw Viktor dead. He never received a last letter. There was never a goodbye. And so, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't completely accept it. She didn't know that, somewhere far away, buried in a military hospital, Viktor was still struggling to survive. But destiny had other plans for that story. The last thing Viktor remembered was the smell of gunpowder and the biting cold of snow mixed with blood on the battlefield. After that, everything became a blur. When he opened his eyes, the blinding light of a lamp made his head throb. It was alive. But for a moment, he wondered if he really was among the living, or if this was just the last fragment of a dream before he died. He tried to move, but a searing pain ran through his body. His chest was burning, and his shoulder was bandaged. A buzzing echoed in his ears. The war didn't kill him, but maybe he would have done something worse. Time was a confusing concept inside that makeshift hospital. Hours, days, weeks. Victor wasn't sure how much time had passed since he fell on the battlefield. Injured men groaned around him. Some called for mothers and wives. Others would never open their eyes again. He didn't talk much, because there was a void in his mind that scared him. He remembered the combat, the snow, the screams. But when he tried to remember what happened before that, everything was hazy. One of the doctors noticed his confused look and approached him. "Your name is Victor Petrov, soldier of the Red Army. He was found injured after a battle and taken to a field hospital. You have been unconscious for days." Victor blinked slowly. His name seemed familiar, but "I don't remember much." The doctor sighed. "This can happen. Many soldiers experience severe trauma. It can take time for memory to return." Victor felt a knot tighten in his chest. There was something inside him, something important, which he knew he should remember. But it was as if his mind had placed an invisible barrier between him and the past. He tried to force himself to remember something beyond war, somebody, but all he found was a painful emptiness. Days turned into weeks. Victor managed to recover enough to walk, but his mind remained fragmented, received a new identity. Without clear records of where he belonged, he was sent to a new battalion. No past, no family, no memories. He became just another soldier among many others. And so, without ever remembering the name that kept him alive in the war, he forgot Anna. As Victor was taken to a new destination, far away, on the battlefield where he had fallen, the snow began to melt. Among the wreckage and forgotten bodies, a small fragment of burnt paper revealed itself, the last proof that he had loved someone. But now, even he didn't know that. The years passed, and the war became just a scar on the world. Grief and reconstruction shaped the future. But for Anna, the war never ended. She got used to living with absence, but never with acceptance. Even though all evidence pointed to Victor's death, she never got a confirmation. Time forced her to move on, but it never forced her to forget. Then, the unlikely happened. On a cold autumn morning, Anna was at the village market, as she did every week. His hair now held strands of silver, and the marks of time were on his face, but his eyes were still the same, full of untold stories. As he picked some apples, he heard two men talking next to him. "The war files have been opened. Yes, they are finding documents that no one knew existed." Anna felt her heart speed up. She turned to them. "Excuse me, what kind of documents?" One of the men looked at her, surprised by the intrusion, but responded naturally. "Letters, reports, records of missing soldiers. A Moscow historian has found a batch of letters that were never delivered. They are trying to identify the recipients." Anna's world stopped. Lost letters, letters that never reached their destination, letters like the one Victor could have written to her. Anna was never a woman of great adventure, but something inside her said this was his last chance to know the truth. A few days later, she left for Moscow. The capital was different from what I remembered. Time had shaped it. The buildings were different. The people were new, but the spirit of the city was the same. After hours of searching, he found the address he was looking for. The Institute of Military History of Russia. The building was imposing and cold, but it didn't intimidate Anna. She's waited too long in life to give up now. Inside, a young historian welcomed her. "How can I help you?" Anna took a deep breath. "I'm looking for a letter. A war letter that was never delivered." The historian stared at her for a moment. Then he asked her to accompany him to a back room. The room was full of old boxes and papers. The smell of aged paper and faded ink filled the air. The historian walked to a table and opened a folder. "We received a batch of letters recovered from battlefields. Many were incomplete or damaged, but we managed to restore some." He pulled out an envelope yellowed with age. Anna felt a shiver run through her body. He placed the envelope on the table and gently turned it so she could see the recipient. Anna Ivanova. Anna's heart skipped a beat. His hands shook as he picked up the paper. There was her name, Victor's name, and a letter that never reached its destination. She looked at the historian, unable to hold back her tears. "Can I read it?" He nodded. Anna took a deep breath and opened the letter. And then, Victor's voice, lost in time, came back to life through words written so many years ago. Anna held the yellowed envelope with shaking hands. The world around him seemed distant, as if everything had gone silent. His eyes scanned the name written on the front of the paper, Anna Ivanova. How many years had she waited for this letter? How many nights did she spend wondering if Victor had written to her before the war took him? The historian, noticing the emotion on his face, pulled out a chair. "Sit down, please." She obeyed, her legs feeling weak. He took a deep breath before opening the envelope. The paper inside was worn, marked by age, but still legible. Then, his eyes met Victor's words. "My dear Anna, if you are reading this letter, it means something happened to me. But don't think about the sadness, but about the love I always felt for you." Anna's eyes filled with tears before she could even continue. His breathing was heavy. She swallowed and continued reading. "From the moment I saw you, I knew my life would have meaning by your side. Every day away from you is a greater battle than any I faced on the battlefield. But even in the darkness, your face illuminates my thoughts." Anna's fingers gripped the paper tightly. He never forgot her. "If I come back, I want you to know that I want to spend the rest of my life by your side. If I don't come back, please be happy, love, live, and never forget that wherever I am, I'll be waiting for you." Anna closed her eyes, holding back a sob in her throat. That was it. The confirmation he waited his whole life. Victor loved her until the end. He hasn't forgotten her. I wanted to marry her, but fate was cruel. The war separated them before she could respond. "That letter never reached me," he whispered, as if he were talking to Victor himself. The historian, sitting in front of her, observed her with respect. "This letter was found partially burned on a battlefield. It appears someone tried to destroy it, but part of it survived. It was lost for years, buried in the snow. It was only recently found, along with other belongings of missing soldiers." Anna couldn't hold back her tears. She waited decades for an answer, and now he held the last proof that Victor never forgot her. The historian cleared his throat before speaking again. "Would you like to take the letter?" Anna looked at the paper in her hands. Part of her wanted to keep it forever, protect it like a precious relic. But then, something inside her changed. That letter didn't belong to her. It belonged to Victor. "No, I know where she should be." She stood up, wiping her eyes. His destiny was now sealed. She would take that letter to where Victor was, the only goodbye he could never give. The cold wind blew gently as Anna walked through the old military cemetery. His hands were firmly holding Victor's letter, now protected inside a new envelope. The paper, aged by time, was the only tangible link left between her and the man she loved all her life. After decades of uncertainty, she finally knew the truth. Now there was only one thing to do: take the letter to the place where Victor rested. When she reached the field of white crosses, Anna felt the weight of emotion tighten her chest. The cemetery was vast, a sea of identical tombstones spread out before her. Each one represented a man who was once a son, brother, husband, a man that the war took from someone. She walked between the rows, guided by the historian who accompanied her. "Here you go," he said, stopping in front of a tombstone. Anna held her breath. The cross was simple, without luxuries or distinctive marks, just a name engraved on the cold stone. Victor Petrov, 1920. The empty space in the year of death hurt. He was buried there, but his death was never officially recorded. Like many soldiers who disappeared in war, he was buried without anyone knowing his story, until now. Anna knelt before the tomb, her trembling hand touching the cold stone. Victor, his voice was weak, like a whisper. She didn't know exactly what to say. There were so many words choked inside her, so many years of waiting, of hope and of pain. But then, holding the letter to his chest, he knew what he needed to do. Anna unfolded the paper and, with a choked voice, began to read. "My dear Anna." Victor's words echoed in the silence of the cemetery. She read every line, every feeling, every promise that could never be fulfilled. The years disappeared. Suddenly, she was no longer an elderly woman kneeling before a grave. She was the young Anna from before the war, holding Victor's hands as they walked together through the village woods. She could see it. I could feel his presence there. And when he reached the end of the letter, his tears finally fell. "Sim, Victor," he whispered, his voice broken by crying. "I would have said yes. If he had come back, she would have been his wife. She would have spent her entire life by his side. But fate was cruel. And now, The only thing she could do was leave the letter there, in the place where Victor should have read it. Carefully, Anna placed the envelope on the tombstone and, next to it, a single red rose. The wind blew gently, as if carrying his words to wherever Victor was. She closed her eyes, letting peace invade her heart. "I've been waiting my whole life to give you this answer. Now I can finally rest." All her life, Anna lived with an emptiness. Now, for the first time, she felt complete. Their love never had a happy ending, but now, at least, it has closure. And sometimes, that was enough. The sun began to set behind the hills, dyeing the sky with golden and orange tones. The military cemetery, a place that used to feel dark and lonely, now had an eerie sense of peace. Anna remained kneeling before Victor's tombstone, feeling that finally, after so many years, she had managed to say what she needed to say. She had waited her whole life for this moment, and now he had arrived, but the pain was still there. It was a different pain, no longer the agony of uncertainty, but the melancholy of a love that could never come true. She found herself imagining, what if Victor had returned from the war? Perhaps he would appear in the village, tired and marked by time, but with the same sparkle in his eyes. He would meet her at the market, and she would drop an apple, like she had the day they met. Maybe he would take your hands and say, "I came back to you," and she would have run into his arms, sobbing with joy, holding him as if she would never let him go. They would have gotten married in the small church in the village, and she would have worn a simple dress, but with flowers in her hair. They would have built a home together. Maybe they had children. Maybe he taught the boys to fix things while she taught them to dream. They would have grown old side by side, sitting on the porch on summer days, remembering the follies of their youth, and smiling at each other as they did before the war. But none of that happened. Time and destiny charted another path, and all that was left was a love interrupted by war, and a letter that arrived too late. Anna spent her entire life with a part of her heart waiting. She turned down suitors, not because she didn't want to move on, but because no one was. Victor, she lived between memories and longing, feeling incomplete, always with a part of herself stuck in the past. Now, standing before his grave, she realized something she had never allowed herself before. Victor would have wanted her to be happy. The letter said that, "If I don't come back, please be happy, love, live." But Anna never knew how to live without him. The wind blew gently, as if responding to what she felt. Anna leaned over one last time, ran her fingers over the name engraved on the tombstone, and closed her eyes. "I've always waited for you, Victor, and now, finally, I can rest." She let out a long sigh, a weight lifting off her shoulders, and smiled sadly. She had waited a lifetime for this meeting, but some goodbyes happened too late. Time took its relentless course. The world changed. New generations were born, cities were rebuilt, but certain stories never go away. Anna returned to her village after leaving Victor's letter on his tombstone. For the first time in decades, he felt light, as if a cycle had finally closed. But life went on, and love, somehow, still lived. Anna spent the next few years in peace. He did not marry or have children, but he found joy in teaching the village children to read and write. She became a kind of guardian of the stories. "I always told people that true love doesn't die, it just finds new ways of existing." Young people loved listening to her talk about Victor. For many, it was just a romantic legend. For her, it was the greatest truth of her life. Even in her old age, her eyes still sparkled when she mentioned his name. Anna lived to a ripe old age. His body became more fragile. His hair turned completely white, but his mind remained as sharp as it always had been. In the fall of her senior year, she decided to take one last trip. With the help of a young man from the village, he returned to the military cemetery. The walk was slower that time. The wind was cool, and the golden leaves covered the ground like a carpet. When he finally arrived at Victor's tombstone, he felt like it would be the last time. She smiled, closing her eyes and feeling the breeze on her face. "I never forgot you." She sat down next to the grave, took a deep breath, and he remained there for hours, just feeling the presence of something invisible, but real. It was there, in silence, that Anna fell asleep forever. The villagers found her the next day, with a calm face and a small smile on her lips. And next to you, lying among the autumn leaves, there was a single red rose, as if Victor himself had come to get it. Nobody knew how to explain it, but those who knew the story knew that, somehow, the encounter that never happened in life finally happened on the other side. Years later, Anna and Victor's story was told and retold in the village. Their grave, side by side, became a symbol of eternal love. Visitors always left letters and flowers, as if hoping the wind would carry their messages somewhere beyond time. And on autumn days, when the wind blew through the trees and the leaves danced in the air, many said they could hear soft whispers, like two lovers exchanging promises that were never forgotten. For love, when true, it is not erased by time, nor by war. He lives forever. Victor and Anna's story is not just a war story, it's a story about hope, about promises made and never forgotten, about a love so strong that neither time, nor distance, nor death could erase. How many stories like this were lost in war? How many loves were interrupted without goodbyes? How many letters never reached their destination, carrying with them words that could have changed everything? Anna spent a lifetime waiting, not out of stubbornness, not out of illusion, but because some souls are made for each other, and even when fate separates them, something inside them knows that this love never truly disappears. When Anna closed her eyes for the last time, she knew that Victor never abandoned her. He was with her, in the winds that blew through the village, in the leaves that danced in autumn, in the dreams that never left her. And finally, when her journey came to an end, he came to get her. Then true love does not end with death. It continues in every memory, in every beat of a heart that still misses you, in every promise that even time cannot erase. And perhaps, somewhere beyond this life, Anna and Victor are together now, dancing under the stars, whispering promises in the wind, living the love that the war tried to take from them. But, in the end, he overcame time and became eternal. If you've made it this far, it means this story really touched your heart. Victor and Anna's love teaches us that some promises never die, and that some souls always find their way back to each other. Comment here below, "True love never fades," to show how many people felt the depth of this story. Let's spread this message together, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. This way, you no longer miss out on exciting stories like this, full of love, longing and reunions that not even time can erase. Leave a like, share this video with someone special, and continue following the channel, because some stories deserve to be remembered forever.